So let's go actually see what Isaiah 14 says. It describes a figure called Hallel ben Shakar, or the shining one, son of the dawn. In the ancient world, that was Venus, the morning star, the brightest object in the sky before sunrise. It rises higher than everything else, and the sun comes up and essentially overshadows it. It's gone. And the text uses that exact same image. You were ascending, you wanted to set your throne above the stars of God, above the assembly on the mountain, to be like the Most High, and then brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. And notice here that it says the shining one, the radiant one. That's the third meaning from Nahash. You know, the gleaming bronze, the radiant divine being. It's like the same words, the same profile being put onto this being. So plant Nahash in Genesis 3, and you've got a being characterized by brightness and access to the divine realm, and the exact same trajectory in Isaiah 14. There's a pride, there's an ascension, and then there's the fall. But there's one more thing about this that is really fascinating to me. In Isaiah 6, the beings that are guarding God's throne are called seraphim, which most translations render as burning ones from the verb to burn. But seraph is also a Hebrew noun for serpent, actually. Throne guardian, a serpentine being. It's the Egyptian cultural equivalent to of the Assyrian and Phoenician cherub. It's like different regional context, but same concept sort of deal. A serpentine divine being guarding the presence of God, which means that the Nachash in Genesis 3 isn't a weird outlier. It's literally a recognizable category of being to any ancient reader. It's a serpentine throne guardian in the sacred space operating from the inside. So when you read Genesis 3 alongside Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14, and Isaiah 6 together, which is like exactly the methodology that makes the most sense to me, you get a coherent, consistent picture. A divine being of extraordinary status, who's a throne guardian in the original sacred space, who fell through pride, and whose fall set something in motion that runs throughout the rest of the Bible. And that thing that's set in motion has to deal with the curse. Now, when God curses the Nachash, the language of the curse is interesting in itself. On your belly you shall go, in dust you shall eat all the days of your life. Now, if this curse was on a literal garden snake, I think we have some problems. Serpents don't actually eat dirt. Not all women fear snakes. Some people apparently love them, which I find genuinely baffling, but that's a different conversation. And the enmity between humans and snakes isn't universal either. If you take this as a literal biological description, the curse just doesn't quite work. But if the Nachash is a divine being stripped of status and cast to the lowest place, then it makes perfect sense. This isn't describing what snakes do, it's describing a fall in status. In the ancient world, eating dust is the condition of the dead. Essentially, like the ones who died, essentially. The Nahash is being brought to the lowest place, the realm of death and the underworld. Because interestingly enough, the Hebrew word for earth in the curse, eres, is the same word used elsewhere in the Old Testament for the underworld, the domain of the dead. Maybe it's eretz. I think I got this mixed up. Anyways, Jonah actually uses it in direct parallel with the pit. So the serpent, rather than being told to crawl through grass, is actually being assigned to the exact opposite place of God's presence, the underworld. Hence why Satan later becomes the prince or god of this world, because that's where we are. But then in verse 15, and this is like the line that the entire rest of the Bible is in some ways about, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Theologians like to call this the protevangelium, the first gospel, the first promise of redemption, so to speak. Before there's any covenant with Abraham, before Mount Sinai with Moses and that whole ordeal, before any of it, right here in the 3rd chapter of the Bible, there's a declaration that this conflict between the Nachash and humanity will end with the defeat of the Nachash. The offspring of the woman will crush the serpent's head. And that line, the woman's seed against the serpents, runs from here all the way through the genealogies, through the kings, through the exile, the return, until you get to a specific woman, and the conflict comes to its resolution. It's Jesus. I'm talking about Jesus. And actually, the way that line kind of runs throughout is worth talking about for a second. So the zera, or the seed, is a specific word, and it keeps showing up in places that you're actually supposed to notice. Because right after Genesis 3, Eve names her firstborn Cain. The name sounds like kana, meaning like acquired or gotten. And she says, quote, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And it's interesting that I found that some early readers heard her saying, I have gotten a man, comma, the Lord, as though she thought Cain was like the promised one, like the offspring who would crush the head. That obviously did not work out the way that she had hoped. But eventually, Seth replaces Abel, and then the line continues. The genealogy in chapter 5 runs toward Noah, and then Shem, and then toward Abraham. And then in Genesis 22, after God stops Abraham on the mountain, God says, in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. I think it's the same word, zera, seed. And David also gets a version of it in 2 Samuel verse 7. Your seed will sit on the throne forever. So now it's getting more specific. But Paul makes it infinitely more explicit in Galatians 3:16, where he says, he does not say, and to the offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. So Paul is following the idea the way that a careful reader was supposed to follow it. From the garden, through the genealogies, through the covenant, through the kings, to a single person. Genesis 3:15 was never meant to be a vague prophecy about a future deliverance. It was actually the first stake in the ground for a rather specific one. Everything after that is the story of which offspring it is, when is he born, and how. That's all fine and cool. But here's something that tripped me up when I was first working through all this. And I want to mention it because it's a really easy place to get confused. And it's a rather interesting example. But anyways, in Numbers 21, Israel is in the wilderness, complaining again, like, surprise, surprise, like we should not be surprised at this point. But God sends fiery serpents, seraphim to be exact, in the Hebrew, the burning fiery ones, to bite them as judgment, which is a little crazy. But essentially people are dying. So Moses intercedes, and then God tells them to make a bronze serpent. I bet you know what word that means. A shining serpent, and put it on a pole. Anyone bitten looks at it and lives. All right, it's pretty cool. Now, because the same word Nachash shows up here, it's tempting to connect it directly to the Nachash of Genesis 3, the serpent like in the wilderness as some kind of reference to like the garden. But now initially that made sense for me. It did for me until the serpents in Numbers are God's instrument of judgment. So they're doing what God sent them to do. The bronze serpent on the pole is God's instrument of healing. So these are very different things from like a divine monster in a garden to this kind of serpent here. But what I find cool about that whole like story is that Jesus does something with this passage in John chapter 3:14 that ruffled my feathers a little bit. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. And now I can't stop thinking about the connection of that. The Nachash, the serpent, the shining one, the divine rebel in the beginning whose vocabulary and descriptions about him are, brightness and divination and serpentine form, like that image, that symbol is being deliberately picked up by Jesus and applied to himself on the cross. Look at the lifted Nachash and live. Look at the lifted Son of Man and live. That symbol that in Eden was associated with death, deception, and corruption, here it is, except it's the image that heals, the thing that saves people. Now, whether that's intentional, I would like to think it is, or maybe it's just a striking coincidence, something that, I kind of go back and forth on that. But the more I think about it, I feel like the more intentional that feels. But I also don't want to draw random kind of comparisons that it just kind of like conjure up. But the New Testament eventually just tells you directly. Revelation 12:9, and the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. Now that phrase is going all the way back. The reader is supposed to immediately know who this is. Not a new figure introduced in Revelation, but the one from the very beginning. The one from the garden, and notice what's happening to it. It's thrown down, bound, eventually thrown into the lake of fire. That same downward trajectory that started with the curse in Genesis 3. The Nachash goes to the ground, to the dust, to the underworld, and Revelation just completes that entire arc. And this is the ending that I keep kind of coming back on. Revelation 22 describes the New Jerusalem with a river of life flowing through it. Trees on either side bearing fruit. The face of God present and accessible to his people. It's Eden again. The garden temple is now restored. The sacred space has been reclaimed. The image bearers are now back in the presence of God. And that story, or the story that begins with Nachash in the garden, ends up with the garden returned to what it was always supposed to be. And Nachash was nowhere in it. So the question I started with was, well, what actually was the serpent in Genesis 3? And I think the answer that the text is pointing you toward is to not view this as just a simple snake. When you dig into the language, it's something like this. It's a divine being, a guardian of sacred space, the member of the heavenly council who had access to the most privileged position in creation and who chose to use that position to undermine what God was building with humanity. The serpent is about a prior rebellion in the divine realm spilling into the human one. The pride came and then the fall. The fall in the garden happens in the context of a fall that already happened somewhere else. And that ultimately changes what the story is. And that was the promise I gave you at the start of the video. It's not primarily a story about Adam and Eve, two people who made a bad decision. It's rather the story of that bad decision happening inside a larger conflict that had already started. A conflict that the whole rest of the Bible is about resolving. In Genesis 3:15 is the opening line of that resolution. The offspring of the woman will crush the serpent's head. Whatever else you want to say about Genesis 3, that promise is in there right at the beginning in the very words of the curse. Which is the most hopeful thing that really anyone can read. Snake.